So, hey everyone, I am really excited. I am Kerry Connelly, and I'm here with my two amazing colleagues, Josh Riddick and Bryana Clover. And together we have written a book called Wait, Is This Racist? Specifically for church leaders. It's a guide to how to be anti-racist, a be it yourself guide to anti-racism for church leaders. And we are here to have a conversation to kind of wrap up a lot of the content in the book. I love talking with these two professionals. I love hearing them and hearing what the wisdom that they have to share. So we're going to have a conversation today. We've got some questions to ask each other. We're all going to just kind of do our thing and talk and be, having racial conversations, I think, it needs to become a practice. I think it needs to become a practice. And yes. I think that that's what you're going to witness here. So enjoy the conversation, and we're going to go ahead and get started. And I think Bree, you're going to head us off, right? So
yes,
started.
So my first one is for Josh. I found actually throughout writing this book together that there were a lot of times where we had the opportunity to reflect on our own racial identity. And so my first question for you is, what are the narratives around your racial identity that were shared with you when you were growing up? And today, in the work that you do, how do you help other Black, Indigenous, and people of color identifying people work through their own racial identity development?
I appreciate that question, and it's one that I wish I could answer easily. As a biracial Black person, there was, a slew of messages, both explicitly, implicitly, intentionally, and unintentionally about who I was, what my body was, and what it meant to have the body that I have, the features of my body, my hair, my skin. There was being in this sort of light-skinned privileged space. The grade or texture of my hair, the tonality of my skin was something that both a lot of the Black folks and white folks that I was around sought after and desired and longed for. And there was this kind of discomfort that lived within me that I didn't have that same longing, that I because of the narratives around what it meant to be Black and what it meant to be white. In my adolescent years, I really struggled to feel like I was, quote unquote, Black enough. And I know a lot of biracial people, even some, Black people who are not biracial, feel that tension. But so much of that came from, I would say, too narrow of what it meant to be Black, too narrow of a scope on what Blackness was, that it wasn't hip hop, it wasn't sports. And the white spaces that I was in also held that narrow view. And so they were perpetuating some of those same messages. I'm thinking about in middle school, how there actually was one of the few Black kids in my high school started a rumor that I was Latino. And I cornered him in the hallway one day. I was about ready to fight this kid. I was like, why would you make this up about me? He's like, bro, you're too smart to be Black. He himself being Black, believing that certainly there's no way someone of intelligence could also be a Black person. And so walking around kind of trying to balance and juggle these narratives really wasn't until I got to college and other Black students began to kind of embrace me, envelope me, make me feel like I belong, that I start to deconstruct some of these narratives. So when I work with other Black, Indigenous people of color, we start there as what narratives did you hear growing up? What narratives are about your body and live inside your body? That these kind of racial ideas are manifest in a very embodied way. So I want to hear how people think about that. And I get some incredible stories, the ways in which people understand things like physical attraction, or the neighborhoods they live in, or the type of jobs they're allowed to access. So much of that comes from racial narrative. And maybe not exclusively, certainly, but a huge portion of it does. And if we don't investigate those narratives, we miss out on those ways that we're moving through the world, opting in the narratives that we didn't even know we were holding.
Wow.
Yeah, so well said. Yeah.
Interrogating narratives is so important. I think that's always the work that I'm trying to do, is interrogate narratives and say, is that true? Is that the only perspective? So yeah, that's so, it's so important. And I think it's so important, especially for those of us who are white to hear perspectives like yours, Josh, just because it's an experience that we don't have any understanding of, and if we actually are going to claim to care about our siblings, our BIPOC siblings, then we have to at least have an understanding of what we don't understand, at the very least. So I have a question for you, Bree. In chapter 1, you really talk a lot about the beginning of digging deep into a critical family history. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, I know you've embarked, we're friends. I know you've embarked on this journey a little bit yourself. Can you talk a little bit about where you're at on that journey?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So actually, that critical family history was a new term to me as of earlier this year, honestly. And it made me think back to, my grade school. We had like a genealogy project. And I feel like probably anyone who's been through the public education system in some shape or form has had some kind of genealogy project. And usually it's like, you'd do research about your great-great-great-grandmother or where your family was from. And I feel like that in and of itself is something that is not as easy to do for all Black people, in particular in the United States, to be able to trace their family history back that far. So anyways, I was just making that connection as I was talking of like when we think about the anti-Blackness narratives that even we as biracial and Black folk inherit or are victim to. But anyway, so the critical family history takes it a little bit of a step further, and it's less about tracing your family roots back, however many generations, but it's identifying people, or in this case, one person is enough, and tracing and understanding how their racial identity development and their understanding of race and their identity, the identity that they used, if you will, to survive, depending on the generation that they lived in. So, for instance, the person who coined this term talks about she was researching a family member who immigrated here to the United States, who identifies as white, but when she looked at the time at which her family member immigrated and what was going on politically of the time, that was something that her relative did to survive. Her relative knew that if I identify as white, I get ahead in this country. And so it really takes a critical look at how the movement of our relatives and what's going on politically, socially, culturally of their time, and how that impacts their racial identity and what they claim.
Yeah, and I also think it's so important for white people, and really eye-opening when they take it from that racial standpoint, right? When they start to look at what their racial family history is like, they might start to notice when they actually became white, right? Because maybe if they were immigrants, they weren't always white. Like my family was not always considered white because they definitely came over during the Irish emigration, and so they definitely experienced certain things, but then they assimilated into whiteness and became white, and then took on many of the racist belief systems that would help them maintain that whiteness. Absolutely, they did that.
That's so powerful.
It's powerful to understand that and to recognize how it's in operation in your own lineage, right? And in your own family, and in the narratives that your family passes down, right?
Absolutely,
powerful.
And I kind of did that for myself as a way to feel closer and to my roots, my African-American roots, and to better understand where I came from. And, my grandfather, who I wasn't as close to when he was alive, I grew a whole other appreciation for a Black man who was raising a family in the 50s and 60s. In Detroit. I mean, I have a whole new appreciation for the way that my family had to survive and to live in the midst of the civil rights era. So I think for BIPOC folk, it's also a really important exercise to do, just to understand and to connect to our roots.
100%. And I also want to make clear, when I say that my family wasn't white, that's a matter of the way that whiteness was the epitome of whiteness is the WASP, right? The white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And as Irish Catholic immigrants who were poor, they came over here, they spoke a certain way, they had listened to a certain kind of music, ate a kind of food. There was an ethnicity that kept them from being white, but that was very easy for them to separate themselves from, right? So they were able to assimilate into whiteness quite easily within one generation, right? So it's really easy to understand that. And it's also enlightening to understand that was a process by which they internalized racist ideology in order to allow them to help move them up the ladder of white assimilation, right?
Yeah.
And so when we own that, and we have to, as white people who have that kind of a story, we have to own that. That's part of the narrative that we have to recognize in our own family histories. So, and that gets uncomfortable.
Well,
yeah. So, okay, who's our next question? Josh?
It's me for you, Kerry, because what I'm thinking about is you just name something in a way that really cut off what some people might have used as a move to innocence. That you know, in that moment said, I'm not gonna, you know, and you were just elaborating, but that's something that I've seen you do quite a few times, of not pivoting to what a lot of white folks use as a move to innocence, believing it to be a way to remove themselves from being problematic or racist. And so I would love to hear from you just how you're thinking about and how you are observing and what it means for white folks to not just make a move to innocence, but to actually divest from power. And if they're aware of that consciously or not, how are they doing that, or how are they avoiding that? And either taking steps to push back, move to innocence, performative in some ways.
Yeah.
How are you seeing that play out? Have you felt that within yourself?
Well, yeah, sure. I always feel that within myself. That's all. I think that's, if I'm going to be real, like that's the first instinct, right? The first instinct is to be defensive. And I have, and the other thing that I have to completely confess to is very often when I am called out or confronted with something that I have said or done where my whiteness has come out to play, especially if it's from somebody, from somebody that I know well and that I'm in relationship with, I'm like, oh crap, I'm sorry, you know. But if it's something like out in the world or with somebody that I don't know, I will completely confess that very often my first instinct is to run to all my Black friends and have them tell me how good I am. And I really need to practice agency over it. And I've had to do that a few times. And so what I've actually started to do in that particular instance is I have a group of white people who do this work, who are engaged in this work intellectually and actively doing this work. And so I always go to them first, and I insist on a timeline before I would ever even bring this situation up to a friend of mine who might be Black. And I unpack it with those friends first, and then I will go later. And I always ask for permission to have a racialized conversation or racial conversation with BIPOC. But to get to the question that you're really asking about how white people can divest ourselves of power, I think there's a lot of ways, and it's always contextual. And that's one of the things that I think we really need to resist in ourselves as white people, is we want the one size fits all, answer. Just tell me what to do to not be racist and I'll do it. Right. And that's never the way it's going to go down. It's always going to be contextual. And so you have to be willing to look at a situation and recognize where you have the power. And then how can you divest the power? Is it by not taking up all the space in the room? Is it not using up the mic all the time? Is it being simply the person who provides financial resources and not direction and you're not the boss, right? Like, but rather you're providing resources to people who may be under-resourced, but not under-talented by any stretch of the imagination, right? So it's recognizing where you hold the power and then how you can divest yourself of that power. But first you have to be aware of the dynamic of where the power is. And sometimes it's subtle, right? Sometimes it's subtle. So I think that's primarily how I try to do that. I hope I answered the question. Okay, cool. All right. So I have a question about both of you, and I'm going to get this is just super real. This is super real because I know that this is the question that I'm going to get and that I do get from pastors, from white pastors behind closed doors, right? From one white person to another white person. This is where they feel safe asking this question. So I'm going to ask it of you. And please, again, always feel free to call out my whiteness, because sometimes white questions are infused with a white perspective, and it's the perspective that needs to be corrected before you can answer the question, right? So if that's happening here, please let me know. But let's say, I'm a pastor of a church, a predominantly white church, and there are a few BIPOC in the organization, and we are hoping to put together an anti-racism task force, as Bryana talks about in the book. And I want to be sure to include, I know the right thing to do is to make sure that there are BIPOC voices leading that initiative, but there aren't that many BIPOC in the organization. I would love to know, how can I approach Black and brown-skinned people in a way that is not harmful, in a way that is authentic and truly invites you into a leadership role, but without doing harm, without tokenizing you, without what is a good, healthy way to do that?
That's a loaded question.
I know.
Josh, if you don't mind, I'll start.
I want to acknowledge too that you're not a monolith. You guys are not sitting here speaking for all of the entire population of BIPOC. So yes,
no, that's a great point, and that's where I was going to start.
Sorry.
and even recognizing that if in this hypothetical situation, you as a pastor, to recognize that before you consider any kind of action, is that the work can't be dependent on the two or the few Black and or brown people in your congregation. So I think that would be my first thought, is to be just cognizant of not burdening them to hold all the answers and to lead, but really approach it as a way for you to learn and to invite them in to the conversation should they choose, but is not an assumption that because they are Black or brown that they even want to engage in such a task force. So I guess my first thought too is maybe think about investing in understanding whiteness as a first step and hiring experts or connecting with white people who have done that work and start there instead of going to Black and brown folks as kind of the first step. So that would be my first thought. And I'm really curious to hear Josh's perspective too.
That's a good question. And I actually was just today, and it was yesterday afternoon, I was in a conversation where somebody had made mention of a church, if they wanted to diversify, they could just hire a person of color, and then that would begin to start to expand, and you got to have leadership that reflects what you're going toward. And that's not true. And I've been the person of color in that situation. It does not work out that way. But the question, I guess a question for the question that I'm holding is, what do you intend to be the outcome by putting that person in a position of leadership? How do you plan to empower them in a unique and particular way? How do you plan to ensure their safety in that? Leadership of any kind is risky and dangerous, but you're putting someone who can experience a unique type of harm in a unique type of position. And if you're not going to ensure that there's buffers around that person, support for that person, when people start to push back and that individual or those individuals become the lightning rods of the work, are you going to leave them out to dry or protect them? And say, actually, that was my call. That was our call. We discern that together. Are these people being chosen just because they're the few people of color, the few Black folks or brown folks, or are they equipped in some capacity to do this work? Like, I think experience is, obviously one of the best metrics and teachers we have of understanding of whiteness and white supremacy. But as Bree said, not every person of color is equipped to help lead this conversation. There's other skills that have to be there. And if those aren't there, then we got to step back and say maybe somebody outside of this space is who we need to adhere to. And then I think another thing that churches really just struggle with is the capacity to listen to voices that are outside their four walls or outside their theological scope. That oftentimes we might select this Black person or this brown person because they're passionate, yes, skilled, maybe, but they fit in our theological box. So therefore, they're a safe individual to come in and share with us. And sometimes you got to disrupt that space in order to actually get at what God is doing and how God is moving. And regardless of whether it's race, gender, sexuality, your church does not hold all the answers and the final decisions on things. And God is already at work outside of the space that you're in. You don't have that market cornered. So when we cut ourselves off from that and we don't allow other voices to inhabit our space with us, not only are we not expressing the hospitality of God in our walk as a community of faith, but we're also not able to embody some of the richness and nuance of the Spirit of God, which is deeply needed to do this conversation well.
Yeah, that's amazing. I have a little bit of a follow-up question. I want to understand too, if you guys could both just kind of help me understand a little bit of what as a white person in a situation like that, what kind of language can I use or not use? What kinds of actions should I engage in or not engage in that would help make you feel safe? That would help make you go, okay, yeah, this is a safe thing. Like I have assuming you have the desire to and the passion for the work. Yeah, it would be a safe place. This is a white person who has my back. This is a person who, what kinds of things, indicators do you look for that help you feel safe? And this is with the assumption that these are not performative on the part of the white, that these are authentically going to be engaged in, right? That somebody's actually going to, when they tell us what, my word to white people is when Bree and Josh are about to tell us what we need to do to make them feel safe, we need to actually do it. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to get too far off the question, but I think in this situation, this hypothetical situation that there's only a couple or a sprinkle of Black and brown folks, I think it's safe to recognize that it is not a safe space for Black and brown folks when they are in the racial minority, and that you're recognizing as a pastor that you need to do this work. And so what brought you to the table or to this question, I think that's the first step, is to kind of recognize it or not assume that it is already a safe space or a safe place. And with that said, I don't want to avoid or dodge the question, but I almost feel like it's hard to put a perfect word that would help one feel safe when they're in a situation already where it's just not, when it comes to racial matters. But I do think one of the other, what's the word I'm looking for, characteristics of a white supremacist culture is perfectionism. This idea that if I say the perfect thing or I do the perfect thing, then the perfect result will happen. And so I think there's also, and I know I'm still dodging the question, but like that inner work of recognizing that like you are probably going to mess up and you probably are going to say the wrong thing, and to be open about that with that person, to say, hey, look, I'm coming to the table. I know I have a lot to learn and I recognize I have ownership to learning. But I want to make sure whatever work that we do is not harmful to the few Black and brown folks we have that have blessed us with their gifts and just their presence in this space. And so I want to off the bat say that I am open if you are comfortable. While I recognize it's not your role to do that, I am open always to feedback and for honesty on ways that I can be less harmful in whether that's my words or my actions. So
That's
that would
great.
be.
Thank you. Thank you. Josh, do you want to add to that?
No, not really. She did it. She said it all for what
Awesome.
needed to be said. Thank you, Bree.
Thank you. Okay, Bree, I think you're up next.
All right, Josh, next question is for you. So I think there's a paradox for some white folks who really want to do this work of anti-racism or really want to do the right thing, and but are the sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. So, for example, I hear this a lot from white folks that I do this work alongside or with, that they're told for a long time that they need to elevate voices or amplify the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So they put them on websites and brochures, and but then they get messages of how that's inappropriate. So how can churches, what would be your feedback or advice for churches that are predominantly white? How do they balance this in a way that doesn't do harm and actually is an act of anti-racism? And what's your opinion? Is that even possible?
It's a great question. The question that I'm holding, and I apologize for answering questions of questions, is for the situation you mentioned of putting this kind of visual communication that is often a move that folks make. I want us to investigate and dig deep as to why was that the move we made. And I would venture a guess that many of the times that decision is made to have an external communication of something that is not yet true of our internal lives. We want to have an external presentation of something that's not within the true life of the congregation. It is easy to change a picture on our website. It is harder to investigate our theological treatises and start using Black and brown theologians instead of our all-white theologian structure. It is easier to have a brochure with a smiling Black child that might be a recipient of some church outreach program. It is harder for the worship team to step back and say, we are going to play music differently and switch to maybe a bilingual format. A lot of the moves we make in terms of presentation and projection of visibility, or I'll say performative, but actions that try to communicate anti-racism are easy. They don't require any real challenges. And I think that's this work of anti-racism is about adaptive change. And a lot of the change that folks make is really technical in nature. I can just make these kind of quick fixes here, edit this photo here, swap out this brochure here. And what we're really inviting folks to do is take a deeper kind of look at the culture of the organization and say, why is it that these things are white? How did this come to be? And if we are to change it, what needs to happen? And that gets to some kind of deeper bedrock levels of our cultural narrative and beliefs. And that's where the real work starts to happen. So I think it's possible. I don't think it happens without, stumbling over ourselves repeatedly, making mistakes, which folks have a hard time doing, but also being open to being held accountable. I think, especially after what we saw last summer, there was so many moves towards being quote unquote activated or involved, but no follow-up accountability. By last summer, I'm referencing the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings that followed. There was no accountability to the folks that said, oh, here's what I'm going to do now. So we're going to change our profile picture to a Black square. We're going to have a sermon series. We're going to invite the speaker in. But there's no accountability to ensure that work continued or had any value in and of itself. So I'm going to stop because I feel myself rambling, and that's not helpful.
There was a lot of performative allyship or performative work happening. And I think that's essentially what you're getting at. And
it was a good ramble, Josh.
Yeah.
And also, I think there were a few things that I want to point out is that, number one, I'm really appreciative of the grace that you're both showing in allowing white people to just rest in the fact that we are going to mess this up. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be messy. It's not going to be neat and perfect the way we like it, the way the capitalist gaze and the white Protestant gaze has informed us everything needs to be. It's just not going to be that, right? So there's that. The other thing is that even, and I think a perfect example of one of the ways that white, well-meaning, real people who really want to do something can do more harm is with the black squares that happened. Because essentially what happened, and so for those who don't know, I just think this is a good example of the messiness that can happen. There was and I can't remember the specifics around it, but there was a movement where everybody was putting on Instagram black squares to show solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. But what that ended up doing was they were tagging Black Lives Matter in the movement, and then Black Lives Matter, BLM's content got pushed way down in the feed, and they weren't able to get vital information out to people who were protesting in the streets because everybody was filling their feeds with it. So this is a really good example of how well-meaning and yet very performative social justice and social justice via meme could actually do harm, right? Because this was a time of crisis for the not for the Black Lives Matter movement, but it was a time of crisis in which the Black Lives Matter movement needed to be able to communicate, and they were essentially silenced by the very people who were saying that they were trying to support them. So it's really important to understand that sometimes we need to listen. We need to be listening to what's actually doing harm, because our good intentions really can do more harm. So.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Josh.
I was going to add one more thing to that, because I appreciate you giving that helpful context. And I'm saying this, I don't know where this originated from in reference to the Black Square deal, but I know a lot of people that were doing it because it was the trendy thing to do. And you start asking people who told you to do this?
Mm-hmm.
And they couldn't actually identify it. And I think for a lot of churches, when we start really getting into the receipts of their work, and we say, who told you to do this? It wasn't of anyone of any kind of wisdom or expertise or experience or interest in this work. That's just what I saw other people doing, so I jumped on board. And a secondary form of harm that comes from that posting of those squares was that there was a lot of organizations, and I'll say churches in my community, who I have experienced racism and I have friends who've experienced racism from, and they went ahead and posted that square and said, we're in solidarity with you. But hadn't actually addressed the ways in which they have consistently harmed Black and brown folks who had previously and currently had been in their congregation. So again, you ask the question, who told y'all to do this? Because it wasn't the people in your church, and you haven't done anything to help those people who are hurting and that you caused harm to. It just created a much bigger mess. So which, when we think about those messes and the people that have to deal with that and try and reconcile that, that sort of formation is extremely difficult and really hard to hold. And Bree, you brought up a lot of that in your writing in this book, talking about your experiences growing up in a white church context. And I think that testimony was beautiful and helpful. But I would love to hear more about how that shaped your spirituality, the practices of your faith. In what ways have you found yourself deconstructing and finding maybe a new center or a new formation within your spiritual life?
Yeah, and I would say it's a journey, not a destination. So I wouldn't say I've arrived at a certain place yet. I continue to evolve and to grow. But growing up in a predominantly white church and worshiping in predominantly white spaces really did impact my understanding of the divine in a way that for the longest time wasn't something that was in my consciousness. It was just something that it is because it always has been so. For instance, praying to white male God and learning about blue-eyed, straight, long-haired Jesus. So as I got older and I started more consciously recognizing, wait a minute, like all these if divine is white, and if divine is male, and divine is blue eyes and straight hair, I don't see any of me in that. I don't see my father in that. So, what does that do for my whole understanding of myself, my value, my self-worth, the worth of my family members? So I really didn't start wrestling honestly and intentionally with that until I was much older, but it now makes me so passionate about making sure, and we talk about this in one of the chapters about children and raising children in the church, we've got to take care of our babies. We got to take care of our white babies, our Black babies, and our brown babies. And they need to understand that Jesus and justice are one and the same. And they need to see themselves represented in all kinds of images and explanations of the divine. If we are to create, a future generation that does true good in the world, like that is foundational. So I don't know if I answered that question directly, but that's kind of my reflection as a whole on what kind of damage it does for a child and their understanding of the divine when they grow up in a monolithic culture and a monolithic worshiping space. Did I answer that?
Yeah, that was great. That was great. It was beautiful too. It was really beautiful. Like that's going to make a great paragraph.
Yay.
Yes. Okay. I think you're asking me the next question.
So Kerry, this next one is for you. Would really love to hear your wisdom, as I know you coach white congregations and white pastors. When you are coaching white pastors, how do you address a common fear of upsetting congregation members or impacting church numbers for being too political? This is a real fear. I've heard this a number of times in the work I've done with churches. And it's also a fear that is rooted in white privilege. So can you share, what's your response to that? How do you coach pastors?
So I'm a person who is fairly straight up around this, because I'm just kind of like that anyway. What you see is what you get with me, right? But the bottom line, there's no way to sugarcoat it. There is going to be a cost, and they're probably going to lose members, and that needs to be okay, right? Like it just needs to be okay. It's not going to be nice and neat and clean. They're not going to be able to do it without making some people uncomfortable, first and foremost themselves, right? And I recognize and I companion pastors through that journey, because nobody wakes up in the morning and goes, I get to lead myself and my people into this, deep midnight of the soul. Yay, I'm so excited. Like that's not what they teach you in leadership school to be excited about at all. But that is the work of deconstructing a white racial identity. Absolutely. And it's painful and it's messy. And it's like being on very wobbly ground, right? And so I even put that when I'm working on a proposal for a church. I put that in the proposal. I make it very clear from the get-go. There will be a cost. I have had close family members who have told me to consider them dead because of this work. That is part of the cost of the work. And so I don't sugarcoat that at all. And I think it's really important for them to understand. But I also think that it's important to understand that the crucifixion was also horrific, but resurrection is beautiful, right? And so there is, I believe, a resurrection on the other side of what this painful journey encompasses. And so I always try to try and guide them toward that. But the truth of the matter is there will be a cost. And it's the cost that it's a debt that we owe, in my opinion, right? Like we need to do this work. This is the work that we need to do, and it's going to suck. And that's okay, because it's worth it.
That's really well said, Kerry. And it reminds me, I think it was something you brought up in the book, just about the importance of, particularly for white people who are engaging in this work, to, find their people and to make sure that there is a community created to to do the work together, and to because it sometimes can feel like lonely work, and anyone engaging in this work knows that they're signing up for, it's not going to be easy. There's no easy button for this work.
No.
So.
And, I think that it's also important to say, very important to say, especially since we're kind of primarily speaking to white leaders, right? That for white leaders, there's always going to be somebody pissed off at you. Bottom line, there is always going to be somebody that you're making angry with this work, whether it's, there will be people who believe that you shouldn't be doing this work for multiple reasons. And I mean that from all sides of the spectrum. There will be people who think that you shouldn't be doing this work. And this is the important thing that I came to learn, is that for me, as a white person doing this work, the most important thing that I can remember is to stay in my lane, right? And my lane is companioning other white people through the deconstruction of their whiteness. I don't get to talk about what the Black experience is. I can share what my friends share with me. I can teach out of my love and my care for the people that I care about. And I can do that to a certain degree, but I don't get to co-opt the Black experience for my racial work. My work is to confront whiteness in myself and to help companion other white people as they confront it in themselves. And it's an important distinction, I think, right? Because I think sometimes white people come into this work saying, oh my gosh, we have to help the Black people. And I'm like, no, we are the ones who need healing. It's us that needs repair. It's us that have a wound that needs the touch of the divine, and to be healed, right? And that's, I think, a paradigm shift that white people need to make, especially if you're a white person who wants to lead an organization into anti-racism work. You have to be willing to rip open your shirt and show the wound a little bit, and that's not fun. So,
ooh, can we hit rewind and just listen to that last 3 minutes, because that was beautiful.
Oh, thanks.
Yes, I like when you said not that you aren't here to co-opt the Black experience. That's deep.
But that's something that I think a lot of white people want to do, and I have to even practice agency over it, because I have so many, my best friend, Aisha, we share a tattoo, right? Like, she is one of my best friends. She's family. Like, my kids have her number on speed dial, right? Like, I want to share her stories, but they're not mine to share, even though I know she would be fine with it, but they're not mine to share. Right. So I have to be careful. I have to be really, really careful about not co-opting her experience. It's got to be about examining my own self.
Yeah. Well said.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, go for it.
Awesome. So I think a lot of times in church spaces where we try to have this dialogue, we equip leaders with tools to kind of force the boat to turn against the current of the congregation. I think there's a lot of value, and Kerry, you said you're going to lose people. Like, a lot of churches think that because everyone's welcome here, that you're not going to, like, anything that'll create division is wrong. And I don't think that that's a good approach either. But can you talk more about how maybe you've helped coaches, or have you helped as a coach, people practice communal discernment and communal listening, and activating the congregation? So it's not just leaders fighting against, the 20-30% of the congregation who's never going to move,
Right.
but maybe help engage the 80% that is either on board or willing to be swayed. How do you walk people through that?
That's a beautiful question, and I appreciate you asking that. And I do think that it's a leadership skill, and one of the things that I think is really important is first and foremost that pastors need to be thinking about deconstructing whiteness as an urgent matter of pastoral care, right? For white people, right? And yes, it will be healing. The more white people who do this work, we will get closer to healing the racial divide in our country, and to the point where we are no longer harming Black people. And the first step in that is healing the white wound, right? So it's a matter of urgent spiritual care and pastoral care. So that's the first thing, is approaching it as a matter of pastoral care. Which means, it's not going to happen overnight. You're not just going to hire a consultant and everything's going to be fixed. It's an investment in relationship. It's an investment in time spent with people and journeying with them, right? And I'll be honest, there are people in my life who are our opinions are diametrically opposed around this. However, because of the way they show up with me in conversation, I'm willing to engage and to stay in the conversation with them, even though they piss me off on a regular basis, right? While there are other people who engage in a certain way that I'm just like, nope, you don't get to talk to me or anybody else in my space like that. Like, that's when I get very protective of my space, right? And I think pastors need to be prepared for those two different, and probably a bunch of other different kinds of contexts, right? Where they may need to sit down with a person and say, hey, your behavior was painful, it was harmful, you did harm to people, and have that kind of pastoral conversation. And then with other people, it's going to be something where, hey, I'm here in relationship with you. I love you. And we need to work through this together, because oftentimes, and this is another rule that I kind of have when I engage with people, and what I coach pastors and leaders to do too, is that we're not ever attacking people. We're interrogating narratives, and everybody's feelings are always valid. The perspectives feeding them may not be. And that's what I try to help people understand, right? Is that your feelings, I get that you got hurt feelings right now. I get that it really sucks to be called out for something racist. And I get that that feels like crap. But your perspective, the perspective that's feeding it, is, for example, making you feel like that was a personal attack on you rather than an interrogation of the narratives that you are embodying, right? So let's try to shift your perspective and then maybe see if your feelings change, right? All of that takes investment. It takes a willingness to show up in relationship. And again, it's messy because people are messy, humans are messy. But that's how I approach that. Does that make sense? Yeah, cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, cool. Okay, so Bri, I have a question for you now. In chapter 5, you mention the Black church, and you also mentioned, outside of the context of this book, a particular experience that you had with a white church trying to, or desiring to, create and partner and form a relationship with a Black church. In what ways do you think that this can be harmful or mutually helpful? Can you talk a little bit about the do's and don'ts of that kind of a relationship, and what can work, what can go really, really wrong?
And this is an example of a learn by experience too. So I'll start with in what ways that kind of a relationship could be very healthy. I think that kind of a relationship can be healthy when the white church has already done the work, individually, and collectively as a church. So the kinds of questions I would ask is, have you interrogated whiteness? Have you interrogated the ways in which your practices and your culture, both internally and the work you do in the community, are harmful to BIPOC population? So I think if in a situation where it's healthy is when the predominantly white church has done that work and they're engaging in wanting relationship and community and and equally mutually beneficial relationship and community work together. Where it can be harmful is if the predominantly white church, if this is the first time that they're engaging with Black people outside of their, so if this is the first time and they're really, it ends up being, which this was my experience, it ends up being book studies and video discussions where it's full of white people waking up to their whiteness and waking up to the harsh realities and lived experiences of Black people. So where that's even more harmful is within those spaces. Number one, just watching videos that talk about violence against Black folks or racism is harmful to, it's a reliving. And then on top of that, if there is that waking up in the moment, there's often white guilt that shows up and white tears. And so there's this unsaid expectation now that the Black community has to hold and to carry that burden of that awakening, which again could be further trauma to the Black congregation. And then it becomes not a mutually beneficial relationship, and it's a consuming relationship where the white church is just consuming, and that can be very harmful and traumatic. So I think it's a great, in both situations, I'm sure it's great intention, right? We think about community, and if we want to learn and we want to grow, then we have to be in proximity with people who look different from us. Yes, and you have to do the work first, start internally, then understand how you can create relationship and create community and do life together with different races when you all are kind of coming down to the table with that same understanding.
Yeah, I love that. And I also am hoping you can talk also about the way that the white savior complex can, sneak its way in there. Not even sneak, it just kind of walks right through the door and says, hey, I'm here. Right? Hey. And, I think that's really important because so often in those relationships, the assumption is that the white church is there to help the Black church, right? And there's never the assumption that the Black church has a lot to offer. Yeah. Let me rephrase that the white church has a need and something that it is lacking and missing, and that Black church can help them, can minister to them. There's never that assumption, really, you know. So I don't know, can you talk a little bit about that?
You're exactly right. And I think we talk a lot about this too, in just the ways in which church in general participates in mission opportunities. We talk a lot about the importance of doing ministry with and not ministry for, because stereotypes, prejudice is inherent in charity work. Right? Mm-hmm. It's like, we're coming because you have, like, we're here to save you. We're here to help you. So in the context of a white congregation, creating, being in relationship with a Black congregation, it's easily, without doing the work first, comes across as we're doing this because it's the right thing to do, because we're all God's children and we all should love each other and we're all equal under God's eye. And poor Black people are, just they're not treated equally. And so it's like going into that situation with the poor Black people mentality, that's further perpetuated by underlying racist ideology that might not even be in the consciousness yet of a white person who has not done the work.
Right.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
I don't know if okay.
I think so. Josh, do you have anything to add? I have another question that's totally off book, but I want to, that's a little different, but I want to give Josh the opportunity to respond.
I think, a couple things that sit around the conversation, sit around the question of how do we build those collaborative spaces is there is an ingrained, both in our language and kind of our pedagogy, an ingrained superior belief or conviction of superiority of whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
So we say church, we say black church, we say worship music, we say black church music or gospel music. I mean, these small ways, we say theology, black theology or liberation theology, these kind of small ways that subjugate those spaces to be inferior. And I know in a lot of white church spaces, there is a implicit affirmation of Eurocentric theology as the predominant and primary and preferred theology of God. And that's just not true. And so I think even before in engaging with these churches, we have to really sit and think about the ways in which we're perpetuating some of those things as congregations. How people in our congregation are going to view the cultural practices, the liturgical practices, the theological practices of a white church with a greater degree of authority on God than the black church spaces. And they may, oh, that was cool, that was fun, that was, we got our bodies moving. There's almost like this exotic voyeuristic response that we really have to check. That I see in a lot of spaces because one, it's foreign, but two, because it's different and it's not white, it's therefore less than and inferior. And I think getting to the root of that can make some of those interactions it's certainly harm reduction. I'm not sure it makes it harm less, but certainly harm reduction.
That is a brilliant point, and I'm really, really glad that you brought that up. And it reminds me of something else that I learned. Like so often, a white church, or actually, I was just, when I was writing Good White Racist, I came across this information that is specific to schools, which is this idea that schools that have a predominantly white student body never really have any kind of diversity training until there's a racialized event, because they don't actually consider the world to be diverse. They consider the world to be white. So why do I need diversity training? Even if I'm in an all white school, I don't need diversity training, because why would the world is white, right? And it is this viewpoint that the world that we are ministering to is white. Oh, except for those people who practice Black liberation or, theology, or who sing gospel music, or right. And so I think that the point that you're making is a key part of deconstructing whiteness is how much do I center whiteness, right? How much is my whiteness, my normalized view, the lens that I see everything through. So that's brilliant. And it's also really hard. And the thing that I'm going to say to white people who maybe don't want to hear this is that a lot of times we are going to have that pointed out to us by our BIPOC siblings. Sorry, not sorry, but like, that's just the truth of it. Because we just can't see it. It is a place that a part of our viewpoint that is invisible to us. And so I hope that when it is pointed out to us, we can respond with grace and gratitude rather than with defensiveness and obnoxious white tears. So I'll probably get in trouble for saying that, but whatever. I would love for you both to weigh in on this. And I think it's a really important question is because Josh, you were talking a lot about space. And Bree, you kind of mentioned that too, when we were talking around partnering, churches partnering. I really want to understand or explore a little bit more the importance of BIPOC only spaces for BIPOC and how that is different from segregation, why it's important, why it's one of the most hospitable things to do for a white leader who truly wants to embrace anti-racism will fight for BIPOC only spaces and provide them if possible, and then also because Josh, you also were asking about communal conversations, right? And having these conversations and communal listening, and how I've done a lot of workshops around the book. And there have been instances where we've done rooms that have had a mixed population, right? And then there have been rooms where it's been BIPOC only and white only. And I personally think that both are imperative to have those combined rooms and then to have the separated rooms. And I think that it's really important for there to be an agreement when during a combined room that for the BIPOC, they need to understand that they're entering a risky space, right? That the white people in the room are going to do our best to not make it dangerous, but our whiteness may come out to play, and BIPOC need to be prepared for that, right? And also they get to call that out when it's happening, and white people need to be willing to hear that, right? So that there needs to be an agreement. So I would love to hear what you guys think about all of that.
Bree, do you want to start us off? Do you want me to kick it off?
Go ahead. Unless you want, if you're still.
I know, it was totally off book. Sorry, guys.
No, it's okay.
I think it's an important question.
No, I have an answer. So social psychologist, of which I am not, but aspire to be in some ways, have spoke pretty robustly on the benefits here and this idea of creating space. I think what I want to sit with is two ideas. One is that within the divine life, there is interest and movement towards the particularities of our lives. That God is interested in the uniqueness and the complexity and nuance of our individual lives. And if we as a community of faith, a congregation, want to reflect the divine life, then we have to be interested in attending to the unique particularities, nuance, and complexities of people in our congregation's lives. That also includes their racial identity. And with that idea has to come a separate idea, that as white folks, you do not have all the tools to meet everyone's needs. Which means if you want to care for the particularities, uniqueness, and complexity of Black, Indigenous, people of color in the lives that they hold, then you have to also be aware that there's things I cannot provide to those uniquenesses, to those nuances. In which case, if I cannot provide them, then how do I make space for somebody else to? How do I make space, just as the divine life has made space for us to be in a relationship, for those particular areas to be nurtured, cared for, attended to, so that when we come together again, there is an ability to bring one's full self present. That is what I would call any pastor or any person to consider. Is like, why would you be resistant to making space for things that you cannot provide? Why would you be resistant in holding up things and needs that need to be met that you know you can't provide or should know you can't provide? And in that process, ideally, people can begin to investigate kind of their own internal intentions and where their disruption is. And in the book, we talk about how we frame segregation in a way that makes it really difficult to see the differences here, which there are many. And so I won't, dig too much into that, but I want us to sit with this idea of within the divine life, there is this practice of making space for one another, both within the Trinity, both within congregational life. And this is one of those ways we get to make space for someone in a really holy and profound way.
Oh, it's beautiful. That was gorgeous.
I don't need to add anything.
I know, that's like mic drop material right there.
Yeah.
That was good. That was good. Okay, thank you. Thank you for going off book with me and having including that in so beautifully. Okay, whose turn? We did the chapter 5 thing.
It's mine. It's our last question.
All right.
Yeah. And this is one of my favorite questions, not because I wrote it in the paper, but because we've mentioned it a few times, and a few different ways. And so, Kerry, I am interested as to how you, as a white person, hold yourself accountable in this work. To whom or to what are you accountable to?
So, as I said before, I do have I think it's really important for me to respect the Black and brown people that I love and care for, who I am blessed enough to be in relationship with, by not going to them immediately with racialized questions, right? So I do have a small group of white people who are trained and dedicated to this work. And so when I have an issue, and usually because I'm because I'm doing this work somewhat publicly, most of the times, I'm not going to say that I never mess up with my friends, because I definitely do. But most of my critique often comes from in the public sphere, in the public domain. And so when that happens, I will seek out the counsel of my white friends. And depending on my own emotion, the strength of my own emotional response, the longer it will be before I will bring it to one of my friends of color, because I want to make sure that I'm not just vomiting all of my emotions onto these people that I care about. But it is important for me to get feedback, honest feedback, objective feedback from the BIPOC community, right? So that's really important. So so first I try to deconstruct whatever the incident was or whatever happened, or my own thought process with my white friends. And then when I feel I'm in a healthy place and I can do it well and without harm, I will ask my friends if here's how I usually say it. I will ask my Black friends I will say something along the lines of, if you have the time, the willingness, the desire, and the energy to do so, when you have a moment, would you be willing to have a conversation with me about a racial experience that I had, or about something that happened that I maybe need some feedback on? And I also tell them, no is a complete answer and a perfectly acceptable response, right? So, because they don't owe me anything, they don't owe me a conversation around this stuff. And so then once, if and when they say they are willing to do it, I really work hard to be as objective as possible and already go into it owning where my own whiteness came out to play, right? So I try to be really aware of that, and then ask for feedback about what I could have done better, what I might be not seeing, what might be invisible to me. And usually my friends tend to be pretty honest with me, which is both a blessing and a curse. And I'm only half joking. I'm very blessed to have friends who are honest with me about these things. And then, and here's what a lot of people get offended by this, but not the people I do it with. After the conversation, I will usually Venmo them $25 or something and say, hey, please go buy some coffee on me with a friend or something like that, right? Go buy yourself some bubble bath, whatever. Just because I really want to let them know that I value their time and I honor them. And, Black people's labor has been undervalued, especially emotional labor has been undervalued for so long that that's just a way for me to resist that a little bit and tell them how much I love and care for them and appreciate them. So that's basically my own personal accountability. And then there's on Facebook, I just apologize. It just happened just the other day. I said something and that was unrelated. And then I expressed a desire to just go read womanist theology. And somebody called me out and said, that was tokenizing us. You shouldn't have done that. And I was just like, oh, at first I was like, well, wait, I'm not sure I understand. Then I was like, oh, you know what? I can see what you're saying. I'm sorry. And then I updated my post and I said, it was brought to my attention that this is what this post was tokenizing. I apologize. I leave my stuff up so that other people can learn from it. I don't take it down because that just keeps me looking nice and pristine. And that's not the truth. And so I left the post up so everybody can go to my Facebook page and read it. So that's how I do it.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Of course.
Because I think I know within the scope of what you're saying, this idea of friendship is one of mutuality and reciprocity, but having been on the works-cited page of many a white people as their Black friend, without consenting to that, can you talk about how you define friendship? Because I think there's going to be a lot of readers who are going to say, yes, I have Black friends, and I let them hold me accountable. I reach out to them and say, hey, will you look at this or check this out? But without having done any of the necessary work to frame what that relationship actually looks like.
That's a really great question. And, you know, I want to answer this truthfully and carefully, but I honestly don't think that I don't think it's fair for me as a white person to consider myself in deep relationship with a Black person unless we've had a conversation around race, and preferably a conversation in which they may have had to confront me with something. I feel like that's almost a benchmark for a real relationship, because here's what I know, or what I believe anyway, is that as a white person entering into relationship with a person of color, the work is mine to earn the trust, and to demonstrate my trustworthiness. Not that I will always get it right, but that I'm aware and that I want to do the right thing, and that my goal is to not do harm, and that I'm aware of the ways in which I might do harm, just because of my embodiment, right? So I try to be really, really aware of that. And so I don't think that we can have, I mean, there are a lot of, all of people that are flashing through my head are people that I've had that I consider good friends, are people with whom I've had deep racial conversations with. And very often they've had to call me out. Not always, not all of them, but many of them have had to say, we got to talk about that. and I just feel like that's something that leads to deep, real relationship.
And might I add, and we might want to take this out, but I think that this idea of cross-racial friendships we could have like a whole hour to talk about that. And I would like to challenge, any listener, that if you are a white person and have a BIPOC friend and have never had a conversation about race, I think that's worth interrogating in and of itself. And to be honest, that's something that me as a biracial Black person has had to break up with some white folks over the years. Really good friends, but after years of friendship, not ever talking about race. And I think it's not necessarily safe to assume as a white person that if you have a friendship with a BIPOC and you've never talked about race, it's because they just don't want to. Because I think that on the other side of that is, are they comfortable enough with you to do that? And so, I don't know, I just felt the need to say, like, friendships, just understanding friendship and understanding cross-racial relationships, I think is something really, really important for us to think about and to process for any of us engaging in this type of work.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Josh? Yeah.
It does. And I just want to highlight a couple of things. My fear, and the thing I've seen play out so often, is that people take notions of what both of y'all just said and say, I got that. For sure. I check all those boxes. Because we haven't really, and people don't do the hard labor of saying, well, I texted my Black friend during the George Floyd protests and asked how they were doing. They said they were doing pretty shitty. We had a conversation on race. Or we met up over Starbucks, and I was just, wow, I'm pouring out my grief to them. Yeah, we had a conversation on race. But Kerry, you gave very, I think, tangible examples of mutuality. Can you look at this? Can you reflect on this? Can you review this? In return, I'm offering this. And I think that is missing. And Bree, you were pointing at this as well, as I think that's what's missing in a lot of these contexts, is that there is not mutuality and reciprocity. And I remember when I first, I came out of college at 22 and started doing ministry, and very quickly became the Black ministry friend of a bunch of men twice my age. I didn't feel I had agency to consent to that relationship, and yet I was being cited as, my Black friend Josh. And we have to also consider how we have power over people. That you may have a Black person in your congregation, but because they are a lay leader or not a leader at all, and you are, like, you don't get to just say that's up front. Do they really get to consent to that? You might have a younger pastor in your kind of pastoral circle but do they really get to consent to that relationship? And what is that relationship built on? Is it mutuality and reciprocity? And have both parties agreed to what that actually looks like in motion? And I know both of y'all have friendships that have done that, and both of y'all have had friendships that have fallen apart because it hasn't happened. Um, and I think too often a lot of these relationships become the solvent of our racial inequality, but we can't even with the one that's not right. But two, we can't even frame what relationship even means in a meaningful way to execute on that flawed vision.
Thank you. So thank you for pointing that out. And I want to even expand a little bit more about the agency issue, because I think that and I've done it. I tell a really painful story about it in Good White Racist. Oh, so painful and so public. But it taught me such a good lesson. This idea that white people tend to do this thing where we just assume that because we're being nice, that all the Black people in the room want to be friends with us, right? And we assume relationality really fast, right? And we don't realize, and this is what I try to always remember, is that just because I know that I wrote a book about racial justice doesn't mean that the next Black person that I meet knows that I'm safe and feels safe with me, right? And wants to automatically be my friend. And guess what? As a completely separate human from me, they get to have self-agency and decide all for themselves whether they want to be in relationship with me or not. It's not just up to me, you know? So your talk about self-agency and mutuality and reciprocity, it's such an important aspect of friendship that I don't think white people really understand, especially the power, just the power of our embodiment and what it brings into a relationship, an interracial relationship, friendship, that there's embodied power just right there, right? And that makes me inherently unsafe for my friends, and I need to do the work. The work is mine to do to prove myself trustworthy. So, thank you for answering that question. So we just talked about a whole lot of things we could talk about. There's so many other conversations we could have. So I definitely encourage everybody. Our contact information will be below this on YouTube, also on my website, probably on Bree's and Josh's websites as well. So this information will be available to you. You can reach out to any of us if you have more questions. We'd love your comments. And thanks for watching.